Trust God. Work hard. Don't be afraid to change your life in your 20s. My life is pretty comfortable right now. I've got a great job. I've got comfortable setting, comfortable surrounding, and it's very easy to fall into that place of feeling happy about your life. But underneath it all, I still knew that there was so much more in the world I wanted to do, and so much more in the world I wanted to achieve, and so much more that the world had to offer. But I didn't take that chance, and I sort of sat there and carried on with my comfortable life. And it finally took God, and it finally took Candace to kind of push something into my path, which was so left field. But I knew that it was the right thing to do, and I just said, I have to do this. Change your setting, change your career, change your life. Research, read, go out and make up your own mind. Determine what you actually believe, what you actually believe in, what your system of beliefs is. Go and challenge, question. And then when you've made up your mind about, where your opinions lie, go out there and shout it from the rooftops. That in itself is inspiring.
The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is...
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is George Farmer, the British political activist, conservative commentator, and chairman of Turning Point UK. You were heavily involved in Britain's campaign to leave the European Union, stating, quote, "Brexit is all about restoring choices and sovereignty to the individuals of the United Kingdom." Later, you launched Turning Point UK to promote conservative ideology on university campuses across the country. Here, you campaigned for free markets, limited government, and personal responsibility with your motto, question, challenge, fight back. Your family is one of the Conservative Party's most influential supporters, and your father, Baron Michael Farmer, is former treasurer for the Conservatives and life peer in the House of Lords. Last year, you married Candace Owens, the American conservative campaigner and fellow activist. Together, you are dubbed the new right-wing power couple. George, welcome to London Real.
Thanks, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here.
Great to have you. I'm sure that sounds strange when I say it back. We'll get to that. Before we get started, I just want to announce to everybody that we are streaming now on our new Digital Freedom platform, which is a censorship-free, independent broadcasting system that is of the people, by the people, for the people, and available exclusively on our website at freedomplatform.tv. Can everybody watching us now please share this link via the sidebar to any and all of your social media channels? Let me just repeat that. Can you share the link via the sidebar to all your social media channels? Just ask your friends and family to give us 15 minutes and they can decide. George, I pledge to you and everyone watching us that none of this conversation will be edited, censored, removed, or banned, and that anybody in the world can watch the full version of this episode free at freedomplatform.tv/farmer. Thanks to the generous donations of over 34,000 people around the world, we affectionately call the London Real Army. For anybody wanting to become a founding member of the Digital Freedom Platform, they can visit freedomplatform.tv/give to donate and fight with us on the front lines to protect our human rights. Here at London Real, we've been a platform for free speech since 2011. And George, I'm excited to have you here today. Maybe we start with talking about freedom of speech. I know it's something you've been pretty vocal with in the past. You know, for 9 years, I was broadcasting conversations, and it wasn't until April 6th of this year where we did the second largest YouTube live stream in the world that was subsequently deleted and banned 30 minutes later. And I've been on a razor edge with YouTube, and this is 8,000 videos, 250 million views, and I've been told by my rep that I'm one upload away from being completely deplatformed. And it feels like when we say something that's against their quote unquote community standards, which are super subjective and seem to change at a moment's notice, then we're censored. And it just feels like there's literally a handful of people in Silicon Valley that are controlling so much of our free speech. Curious what you think about free speech and then this concept of digital freedom of speech.
Yeah, I mean, look, it's a really hot topic right now, Brian. And I mean, you've tapped into that that theme very well. And I mean, I think the concept of freedom of speech is so precious to the Western values. I mean, it's literally the bedrock upon which our entire society has been built. And we are so close to slipping over that edge right now. We're so close to slipping into this censorship world. I mean, we already are. We're straying into this gray area where the tech companies really become the arbiters of what is and isn't moral truth, and that's a very dangerous place to be. I mean, if you look at previous totalitarian regimes of the past, you look at the Soviet Union, or you look at East Germany, or even you look at Yugoslavia. It was, and you look at China to this day. You have regimes which are basically saying what you can and can't say, and the way they enforced that was through the platforms of the media. And of course, George Orwell wrote, Newspeak became the medium in 1984, which he talks about, where of course you have to rewrite language. And what's happening now with the modern censorship movement, you're rewriting language. You're saying that certain words become anathema to popular usage. Certain terms become all encompassing. So the term racism, or whatever it is that we're talking about this day, has become so broad brush now that anybody saying anything can be tarred with this brush and then become censored. So that has become the new norm. And I mean, you've even seen it happening, of course, to the president, which is incredible, because the tech companies are literally deciding what the president of the United States can and can't say on their platforms. Now, of course, the way they've evaded that has been through the status of saying, well, Section 230 under the Supreme Court, New York Times versus Sullivan, we can say, well, we aren't a publisher. We are, we're just a platform. Now, that is an absurdity. And you've seen the Supreme Court justices, some of them have come out and said, oral arguments have been presented saying that they'd like to retest the case of New York Times versus Sullivan. Now that, if that happens, is a very, very important case, because that would actually then push the tech platforms into the region of publisher rather than just platform. And that is really what they are these days. They are a publisher. They're not just a platform. So we as conservatives have had to, play a very, very tight game on what we can say on platforms, because as you have just made yourself clear, you're one upload away. And that's very dangerous, because then now you're also seeing this push, which is obviously why you were advertising this at the beginning of the conversation, but you've seen this push towards trying to go direct. And actually that, of course, is really the ultimate way that we can share our content, is just by going direct. And you've seen other people do that in the past. You've seen, obviously, Alex Jones, for example, has long been a direct person, because he's been taken off everywhere. Laura Loomer, who's running for, Congress in Palm Beach, she was deplatformed from pretty much everything. And now she's had to go direct, and Facebook are still trying to push her out. And they actually have clauses in their contracts which have literally carved her out of being able to come back onto the platform, even if she's an elected representative. So the ultimate way that we have to deal with this is by going direct. And so we're also looking at that model over here more and more conservatives over here are trying to establish themselves with their own media presence, independent of the tech platforms. And then, of course, you've also got the rise of the free speech advocate platforms. So I mean, for example, Minds, which is run by Bill Ottman, and Parler, which is, which has become well known. That's obviously started rising as well. And those platforms will get more and more traction as the free speech argument on things like Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram become more and more scrutinized and become more and more censored.
Do you think the free market will solve this problem, or do you think we will need regulation? Because one of the interesting examples was, Joe Rogan made a big deal to sign with Spotify recently, reported to be $100 million, maybe more. But I believe one of the reasons is he wasn't very happy with some of the censorship at YouTube, and that way he thinks he might not be censored. I mean, do you think the free market will sort this out, or do you think the monopolistic power is so strong with these kind of three companies, Facebook, Google, and Twitter, that that might not work?
That's a very good question. I mean, I like to believe in the power of the free market, and I do think that there's sort of two answers to that. My ideological commitment, which is I think the free market will sort it out. And then there's the reality right now, which is that the free market is not sorting it out. And that's actually become almost more concerning, is that particularly, for example, in the wake of what you've seen in the US in the last 2 months, this whole campaign for Black Lives Matter, this huge push from the corporate establishment to move itself into favor with the woke progressive culture has meant that at some points you've seen corporates doing what is clearly outside of their economic interest, and they're not acting from the profit motive. That concerns me greatly, because when you see that, it's an ideological commitment to a progressive ideal rather than simply the profit motive. And of course, Thatcher, in Statecraft and in her books, writes clearly about the benefits of economic capitalism being that we don't deal with anyone from benevolence. I'm not dealing with you because I really like you as a person, and I'm also not dealing with you because I don't like you as a person. It's the pure profit motive, it's the pure market motive which drives our entire interactions on an economic basis. Now, as soon as you start taking that out of the equation, you start saying, well, I'm only going to deal with you because, I like you or I don't like you, then actually what you've got is an ideological system where people are excluded from the economic system. They can't buy into the economic system. And that's very, very dangerous. And what you've seen with some of these tech companies is a move towards this ideological, we're only going to deal with people if they're progressive enough for us. And that's very dangerous. Now, coming back to the Joe Rogan point, yes, I mean, hopefully we're going to see more of that. And I think you will, because I also think the purchasing power of a lot of conservatives is massive. Whether or not they like it, whether or not the tech companies like it, if you're going to censor conservatives, eventually you're going to censor vast swathes of the population. Minimally, you're going to alienate the 63 million people who voted for Donald Trump. That at a minimum. Or in the UK, you're going to alienate, if you're campaigning against Leave or against the Conservative Party, or whatever you like to say in the UK, you're going to alienate all those millions of people who voted Leave, and you're going to alienate the millions who voted for the Tory Party. So at some point, the economic power of that group is going to have to be felt. Now, whether that is simply by saying, I'm Parley, here's a platform through which you can express yourself, that could be a huge possibility. And that, in some way, that is, of course, the free market establishing itself through competition. Now, do those monopolistic tech companies have so much weight that it is impossible to break them? I mean, you're moving very quickly into that world. But if things like Spotify can come along and say, well, actually, we've also got a really big, heavy stick to hit with, and we can give a platform to quite a few of the conservative voices, then I think at the end of the day, that is the free market sorting it out. And really, you just have to withdraw some of the power from those major tech companies. And of course, the other touted route in the US has obviously been antitrust, which is still being kicked around in Congress.
Yeah, the one thing, America's had a history with dealing with monopolies, whether it's been in steel or oil and gas. But this new digital space is something I'm sure the founding fathers never saw coming, where, I think there's a digital identity you have out there. And sometimes you don't know that this war is going on in your brain and on your mobile phone. And sometimes, you don't know that these things are happening to you, that your ideas are being co-opted. And it's happening right in your living room, whether that's happening from Facebook or Twitter or the left or from China or Russia. And so it's this weird kind of, it's like a weird warfare, almost like a weird guerrilla war or shadow war, where I don't know if even an individual knows it's happening to them. So it definitely seems like a tricky one to fight back against.
Yeah, and I mean that's something which comes across with me quite a lot in the US. I mean, I deal with a lot of Candace's, media, sort of digital media presence and advertising and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, what amazes me often is when you talk to a room of supporters. I mean, there's two things which come out. First of all, they're very unaware of exactly how much power the digital media companies have, and that's a frightening thing to then present to them all in one package and say, guys, by the way, they know pretty much everything about you. 70% of your personality can be derived from your social media presence. That's a terrifying thing. Most of them have Facebook and Twitter, and they use it to keep up with old friends, and they think that's pretty harmless. Little do they know that, Facebook can track, basically when your dog needs to be taken to the vet. It's a terrifying amount of data which you input into those platforms and which they then take away and will sell to other people. So, I mean, that's the first step. Those people don't know what's going on. The second step is also that, when it comes to dealing with social media, people are volunteering that information. That they are actually saying, I want to give this information away, and as a result, they think that it's totally harmless going into a system which is benevolent. And of course, at the end of the day, actually, the social media giants are then dictating what will and won't be fed back to kind of the political campaigns, the political machines, what adverts you're going to see, how many times a pop-up button's going to appear saying, support this candidate, don't support this candidate, this person's evil, here's some news you may not have seen. So when you start digitalizing that whole, basically all information, and you're quite right, the founding fathers would have never had any idea that this much information was going to be presented, to a few people in Silicon Valley. At the end of the day, it's a terrifying monopoly of information. And you never had a monopoly of information before. You've had a monopoly of, as you said, steel, you've had a monopoly of oil and gas, and those are resources that everyone has to consume, which is why it's very easy for the government to come in and say, we're going to break up this monopoly. When it's a monopoly of information, it's such a quagmire you end up in, because you then say, well, how is information, when do you have too much information? When do you have too little information? Where does the line get drawn with information? It's not like I'm producing a million barrels of oil a day. That's too much. It's, I actually know 85% of your personality. Is that too much? Is 60% too much? So that's why it's got the US in such a pickle. And the other thing, which also is worth bearing in mind, is that 10 years ago this was not the situation. It's changed so much in 10 years, and that's become really difficult for a lot of people to understand, especially in the conservative world. Which is that 10 years ago, did we need to break up Facebook and Google? Probably not. Because it was they didn't have as much power as they did, and so the fight was left absent. It was said, well, we just don't have as much concern about this. In time, they slowly gathered more information whilst they were left alone, until it kind of came to 2016 and 2017. And suddenly people said, whoa, hang on a sec. Now these people have got way too much information. And the trouble is, it's too late by that point, because once you realize they've got too much information, it's too late. And that's exactly where the conservative movement has found itself in the last 2 years, which is that we all woke up a little bit too late to this problem, and nobody took it on early enough. And now the fight on our hands to reclaim free speech from the tech giants is such a huge fight that it takes somebody with some real, cojones to go out there and basically fight the tech giants, and some really deep pockets, because of course these guys are, $1 trillion companies. So now we have a real problem on our hands where it's too little too late. And now we've got to sort it out either through regulation or through competition. And of course, in that meantime, when we're either sorting it out through regulation or competition, you'll have continued censorship. So that's the place that most conservative influencers have found themselves in.
Yeah, it's a really good assessment of the situation. And then there's been a couple cases, PragerU took YouTube to they tried to take them to the Supreme Court, didn't have too much luck in 2017. We're pursuing legal options on both fronts in the UK and the US here. I know Candace has taken action against Facebook, and so we have, but I mean, there's limited things you can do there. And, we were fortunate to raise a bunch of money for this digital freedom platform, and the public reacted. We raised it about over $1 million in about 11 days. So people want it, but still, it's a long haul to fight these companies, especially something like Google.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it really is. And I mean, I think, the other side of the coin is that you've then got a lot of the traditional media companies who have bought in. In a perfect world, you'd have a lovely spread of available media outlets. You'd have some great right-wing print media, you'd have some great right-wing direct cable media, you'd have some centrist, you'd have some left-wing. And what's happened, of course, is that in the last 15 years, but particularly obviously in the last 4, since this quite divisive kind of politics has entered our mainstream conversation, you've had most of the media companies buckle to the weight of progressive mob culture. And that's meant that most of them have moved into the left-wing sphere. Now, what that has done is left a gaping hole in right-wing conservative outlets. And that's a space where the free market could definitely get involved with. And, you could drive a bus through the UK, media, certainly television market, when you've only got the BBC, Channel 4 and, Sky News, which is increasingly left-wing. So, I mean, it's that media space is direct and open, and in the US, obviously, with the kind of migration of Fox News from, with the exception, of course, of a few notable personalities on Fox News, but with the migration of Fox News, most of it to the left, or at least more to the center, let's say, again, that space has really opened up. So there is a real opportunity for the first mover in much of this, and the digital media space is already showing that first mover. I mentioned Parlay, of course there's other platforms as well, but there is a sense that people can act quickly and act now, whereas the traditional media outlets are much slower because of course it takes more infrastructure to launch something there. So you guys have done something which is quite unusual. You've launched a direct TV effectively. I mean, obviously through an online platform, but you've effectively launched a TV channel online, and that's very unusual, and that's given you a greater, it's given you, as you say, $1 million in 11 days. People are signing up, people are interested, and that's the kind of model that works. And so that traditional media space will become more and more left. It will become more and more boring. Less and less people will watch it. I mean, I canceled my TV license last year. I mean, it's just like, why would I watch anything on mainstream TV? I wouldn't. I mean, the only thing which really interests most people is sport. I mean, like, there's a lot of men I know watch sport in British TV, but they couldn't care less about, the news, as it were.
Yeah. Well, it'd be interesting to see what comes out on the conservative side for sure. You mentioned the events of the last 3 months and watching, everything happen from, I mean, the lockdown to the Black Lives Matter protests. And, George, you're in a unique perspective because, you're kind of a stranger in a strange land. You're there, and you're in DC. You've been there for a year or so, and you get to watch this wild and weirdness happening in front of you in a culture that's not your own, and yet you bring, still a lot of Anglo values and a lot of great education that you had about politics, economics, religion, and then of course your better half is Candace Owens, who's on the front line of this fight. What's it been like for you to watch this? And what is your perspective and read? Because I think you have a unique perspective, more so than almost anybody in the world.
Yeah, I mean, it has been a really, really interesting 3 months. I mean, it's been a really interesting year for me. And I think for both of us, and to some extent, there's so many different answers I could give to this. I'll try and condense it into something which is manageable. But I mean, the last 3 months has been unlike any 3 months I've ever experienced throughout my life doing anything. And in terms of political activism, in terms of just the kind of mass response to something which was clearly so heartfelt as a nation. Now, I mean, the real game changer was I would say was Candace's video. Obviously that video which she launched on Facebook in response to the death of George Floyd was one of the most, I mean, the response that we got from that was just incredible. And I sort of deal with more of the business side of her organizations, and even my side of the organization felt the kind of like mass outpouring of relief that a lot of people said, we needed to hear something else. And what was staggering was the fact that it comes back to that media conversation. What was staggering was the fact that no media organization was willing to put that forward. And it actually took a 31-year-old woman in her spare room to reach effectively 150 million people to present the other side of the argument. That for me was staggering, because I just think, I mean, obviously I'm married to her, so it's like, she's my wife. Why is it that my wife, out of every woman on the earth, or why is it that the two of us doing what we do, are at the forefront of that charge? It's just incredible that the media now has become such, has totally bought into this left-wing narrative, and therefore will not present anything else. And that is staggering in and of itself. I mean, the other staggering sort of thing for me, I don't want to overuse that word, but the other amazing thing for me, if you like, was the fact that, watching the debate unfold on both sides of the channel, or both sides of the Atlantic, sorry, not the channel. But, you've got this debate in America, which quickly became exactly what we all thought it would become: a mob culture, shakedown and sort of overthrow of the establishment. And that's interesting for me because I've seen it happen in Britain before, where you've seen like the London riots, and you've seen, what probably was justified anger at the beginning against something which they, perceived to be an injustice, quickly evolve into overthrow the monarchy, overthrow, everything to do with Britain, overthrow Churchill, tear down Cecil Rhodes, all this kind of stuff. And actually in the US, it just took on this whole life of itself. And really what was interesting was how far it went this time. And I'm a big believer in the slippery slope. I mean, I was saying things 10 years ago, which have now only just become true, but I was still saying them 10 years ago. And I was saying this to Candace. It's like, you look at debates we were having 10 years ago, and I said, if we do this, this is where the debate will end up. And friends of mine at the time were saying, don't be ridiculous. We're never going to get to that stage. And, you look at, for example, I'll give you one example. The transgender argument is a very, very easy one, right? The transgenderism argument, I was saying 10 years ago, this will become the narrative within 10 years. We will have men trying to change their sex to become women, and then you will have them using bathrooms. And I had friends of mine, I can recall conversations I had with colleagues as well as personal friends who were saying, why does this bother you so much? It shouldn't bother you so much. It's simply what one person does doesn't affect, why does it bother you? And I said, because you will then be allowing, biological men into women's bathrooms. That bothers me. If you have a daughter, do you want them sharing? And that was just something which I was saying 10 years ago, and now it's become very apparent. Going back to the kind of last 3 months, again, it's exactly the same conversation. Racism has become the hallmark of sort of Western liberal democratic debate. It's become a yardstick through which everything is now measured. And that is an absurdity because, of course, we now live in a less racist society than we've ever lived in before. And you'll always get pockets of racism. That's because we're all humans, and you'll always get pockets within society which advocate on behalf of or against certain ethnic groups. That's just how it works. That's how humanity works because there is inherent prejudice within humanity. But the fact of the matter is that, and this is something that Candace will obviously say far more eloquently than I can, if you look at America 100 years ago and you look at America today, if you seriously think you're living in a more racist society, you need your head examined. And it's the same with Britain. And so it worries me how much we're seeing the corporate establishment buy into it. It worries me how much we see the political establishment buying into it, which is both a UK and an American thing. And it worries me that these kind of absurd debates, which are presented by the left as, the new narrative, the new normal, as they like to say, for political discussion in both America, kind of quickly morph into political discussions in Britain. Why on earth are we having a debate about Black Lives Matter in the UK? It's just not the same issue. Trying to draw parallels between, police brutality in America and, police brutality in the UK is just an absurd discussion. It makes no sense. And so as a result, that's kind of been one area where it's just been fascinating for me to watch the way in which the American political establishment and corporate establishment has quickly bought into that narrative. And of course, the reason they're doing that is because it's an election year. And this being my first US election, I've really been involved in to more so than any other year I've ever been involved in, has just been absolutely fascinating because at the beginning of the year, and this is something I say quite often to supporters of ours, if you look at the beginning of the year, pretty much every polling company, I can't think of one off the top of my head, even the left-wing polling companies, the NAACP, their internal polls, were publishing polls which showed that Black support for Trump was north of 30%. You even had one, I think it was a Harris poll, which reported Black male approval for Trump up 42%. The Democrats obviously saw that at the beginning of the year and hit the panic button. So, again, what they did was they took an event in the US, which was a tragedy, and that point has been made very often. And then they turned it into a political football, and then they, made a whole football match out of it. And then it became, how many goals can we try and score with this football match? Of course, what eventually the Democrats will do, and what they've already started to do over here, is score own goals, because they've pushed the debate so far that this defund the police, this whole absurdity around, we have to, pull down statues of every Civil War hero, doesn't matter which side. You saw a Frederick Douglass statue taken down in America the other day. I mean, this kind of commentary is now becoming absurd. It's becoming so absurd that the silent majority look at that and say, "Do I really want, my history, my nation's history rewritten?" No, I don't. So that's been fascinating for me to watch as well. And that I think will have a huge place to play in the November elections over here. So it's been a fascinating 3 months. I mean, my life has just changed so dramatically within the last year and a half. I never would have expected anything like this. And so as a result, it's been great. And it's been a real roller coaster, and it kind of gets more exciting. Of course there's its bad days. There are good days. But it's a very, very different world to be in over here.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I noticed, Candace go all in, and that's what I would expect her to do, but, to be firm in her convictions when these events came out. And she put out things that were, I wouldn't say doubling down, but just being who she is and being who you guys are in the face of what you knew would have going to be expecting to be a ton of controversy and I guess a lot of support that you got. Is there ever a moment where you two are at home saying, okay, it's going to come now, or are we ready to do this, or we're sure we're going to do this? Because you're right. I mean, literally, like you said, 31-year-old, black woman in her spare room is putting out a message that no one else has the balls to do in the world. It's crazy, but nobody else is willing to go all in and put themselves on the line. Every other organization wants to hedge it. Let's be quiet right now. But, her, with support of you, are willing to say, no, this is what we believe in. What's that like when you make those decisions?
Well, it's an interesting one, because there is a school of thought, and I mean, Candace and I kind of buy into this, and this is something I also thought about UK politics for a very long time, which is that the left has pushed the framework of debate in both political cultures into a place where we as conservatives are playing defense the whole time. And as a result, and I mean, this is something that the Vote Leave campaign and Brexit campaign actually did very well, was we kept on pushing the debate into worlds which the Remain side of the argument didn't like, because it made them play defense the whole time. Now, and to some extent, Trump did the same thing. He would come up with these monikers, these catchphrases, which became entrenched and became very difficult for people to get out of their head. Build the wall, lock her up. All of those campaign slogans, which became quite powerful mottos. And as a result, you can boil an entire debate down to simple catchphrases within moments. Now, what the left has done has said, we are going to move the framework of all of these debates into our own ball camp, and then you're going to have to come and play in our park. And as a result, you're going to constantly be playing defense. Now, Candace likes to use the phrase, we're playing by the left's rules and the left are playing by no rules. And I think that's very accurate. And so when it comes to sitting down and sort of saying, okay, this is what we're going to do, what it really takes is a lot of courage. And that is kind of what she and I talk about a lot. And I mean, it's why one of the reasons we deeply respect each other is because of the fact that, both of us are actually more afraid of compromise than we are of, the kind of backlash from what we're saying. And the reason being is because compromise is how we have effectively given so much ground to the left. It's going to take some real fighters. I mean, this is something that I often had feedback about in the UK, was that I often had MPs saying to me, your branding is just too aggressive for us. And I'm like, yeah, guys, but you know what? We've got to fight. We need real fighters. And if you don't have real fighters, then you're in real trouble, because the left is willing to fight by its own rules, and it will drag us into that, ninth battlefield where we don't want to fight. But we're forced to fight because it's the place where they've drawn the lines. And so if unless we start fighting back, and unless we start saying we are not going to compromise and we're going to double down, we're going to push the boundaries of debate from our side, they will never engage. They will never be forced to engage with us, And so as a result, there are moments where I sort of say, oh, wouldn't it be nice just to have a quiet Tuesday kind of thing? But at the same time, then it's actually, what are we in this for? We're in this to win it. And if we want to win it, we need to fight. And so as a result, I think encouraging upcoming fighters and giving strength to the conservative voice is one of the most important things we can do. And that's kind of, that's what I think.
How does this play out in the next 12 months? How does this all affect the election? I mean, like you said, they're weaponizing race, and it's the only thing they have. And so they're going all in on it. And like you said, they're trying to score as many goals as possible. And how does that play out in the election? And how does it play out in the next 12 months? Do they end up eating their own, which is something Dave Rubin thought that they would end up doing? Do they end up taking it so far that everyone wakes up one day and says, wait a second, we don't want to throw our history down the toilet? Or do you think this can get worse? Because a couple years ago with Black Lives Matter, we never saw this coming.
Yeah, I know. I mean, who would have predicted where we would be now? I mean, it is crazy to think about how this debate has changed. I mean, I am very much the opinion that I agree with Dave. I mean, I think the left eats its own. The left constantly eats its own, which is kind of, there's a strange sort of schadenfreude in watching it happen. But I mean, you've seen people like J.K. Rowling, come out in favor of biological women are women, and she's now being cancelled by her own actors. And it's kind of entertaining to watch, because I'm like, this is what will always happen to you guys. You will never be progressive and woke enough. Eventually, you will have to draw a line somewhere when your own brain tells you that facts actually matter. And at that point, the progressive mob will come for you, because for them, science is racist, gravity is racist, the earth is as a whole is racist, nature is probably anti-transgender. I mean, you saw some vegan activists try and stopping a wildebeest from being eaten by a lion, and were both hospitalized in Tanzania not so long ago. I mean, that's the kind of absurd level that we're at. And so, where do I think this goes within the next 12 months? You're going to have, first of all, I mean, there's this thing in the US called the election coming up on November the 3rd. And I think, you're going to have, I personally think the silent majority will come out in favor of Trump. And I'm not just saying that because, I obviously want him to win. The groundswell of opinion and fact and sort of feedback we've got as an organization in the US has been overwhelming. And that's coming from both minority America and, the suburban America and the white America that we plug into. So, there's a huge outswelling of support for a lot of work that we're doing. Our volunteer network has gone through the roof. I mean, it's difficult to describe. We're a small organization. This is the Blexit Foundation that I'm mentioning here, and we're a very small organization. We only have a few employees, but our volunteer network has just gone bananas. And as a result, I'm the treasurer of the organization. It's difficult to keep track of how much we're doing now, because it's just so much plug in, and this is from people of all races, of all creeds, of all colors, wanting to volunteer in all different states to do things like food drops, to do community cleanup, to do, after the riots, we deployed teams across numerous states to help people rebuild their shops. We've distributed cash to small businesses. And the support has just been incredible. And so from that angle, it's been actually really satisfying to watch. And I think that minority voice, and I think that the silent majority voice will be expressed in November. And as a result, I'm hopeful that I think by the time we come to November, that will result in a victory for Donald Trump. Now, on the other hand, what I do think there is that the margin of victory will be a really important factor, in Donald Trump, in Donald Trump's campaign for next year, because I think if the Democrats, are delivered a landslide defeat, it will be very much the same. And I think here's one we did earlier, Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, that the Labour Party in the UK is undergoing a purge of its Corbynite elements right now. You've seen Rebecca Long Bailey, you've seen Keir Starmer kind of try and exercise an awful lot of the Corbynite elements from his sort of cabinet bench. And the reason being is because Corbynism as an ideology, people like Ash Sarkar and Owen Jones and all these kind of guys on Twitter, are clearly not attractive to the majority of people. You've seen that kind of urban, white working class in the Midlands. You've seen the kind of working class labor roots from which a lot of the labor movement was drawn, abandon that ideology because it's now progressive, woke totalitarianism, which has very little to do with helping ordinary people. It's really just about trying to make everyone, virtue signal. And I think that model could well be played out again here in November. And I think the Democrat Party, if it slides to a crushing defeat, will have to ask itself, what place do we have in our party for people like AOC, for people like Rashida Tlaib, for people like Ilhan Omar, who have really led our party into this kind of aggressive, progressive socialism model, which now clearly has no appeal to the American voters. Of course, then you've also got a question as to, well, what role did Joe Biden have in our defeat? And I think he would have a huge one. But I also think you've either got a stale Democratic establishment, Pelosi, Biden, Schiff, or you've got an ultra left-wing, progressive socialist element. So both sides of the party are going to try and purge each other of each other. And as a result, you will probably have a Democratic Party civil war. They've only found common ground in this election because they both hate Donald Trump so much that they've been able to unite over this one point. Now, as a result, getting Donald Trump out of office is their number one priority. If they lose in November, it is going to be, get the popcorn, because you're going to enjoy watching these guys tear themselves to pieces because they will have no idea which way to take their party. And in the UK, as I said, you've had that play out already, and it's been kind of quite entertaining in some ways to watch the Labour left-wing front bench and the Labour Party sort of social influencers, try and justify their own existence in the aftermath of what was the largest parliamentary defeat for, 80 years. So that's how I think it plays out in the next 12 months. And I think also when that happens, then a lot of this kind of nonsense rhetoric we're seeing around, BLM and the kind of revision of American history will die as well. And then it will try and find a place, of course, in the midterms, and it will try and find its place in the next election cycle after that. And it will continue to do so until enough of minority America wakes up and says, not in our name, which is obviously kind of what we're also trying to push forward from Candace's side. So I think until that minority awakening happens, you will see it continue to play out. And when it does happen, then that debate is over.
Yeah. Can you speak a bit more on how, policies in the US, are reflected in the UK and vice versa from, the political establishment and from kind of the populist as well? I mean, some say the Brexit movement was a precursor to Trump being elected. You, again, are in this weirdly unique place where you've got a foot kind of on each side and been able to kind of observe both. How do you see that as overall? And then how do you see that kind of moving forward?
Yeah, I mean, I'll speak about the policy element just first, because I find that to be very, very interesting. The populist one, which I'll come to second, is actually is very, very similar in many ways. The policy element, the policy discussion between the two countries is very, very interesting as an observer, because you do just find conversations in the US which just really aren't on the agenda in the UK. And there's both positives and negatives to that. The positive element is that I would say the US, for example, you come over here and you realize I'll talk about the EU, you realize just how stifling the European regulatory environment has been to British business. And you realize that the golden egg, which has been gifted to us through Brexit, is just bigger than you ever realized. Because as soon as you look at the regulatory environment in the US and you see what can be achieved with a low regulatory.
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.